Kia ora tātou. Good afternoon. This afternoon we are commencing our business with the submission of Craig MacIntosh. Mr. MacIntosh, would you come forward to the microphone, please? Good afternoon and thank you for coming in. We have from you your original submission, and then there are two separate pieces of paper that you've sent to us more recently, which we've also had a look at. So you know where we've got to with your submission, and we welcome you and give you the opportunity now to speak to your submission.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll go through it the way I've written it. The minimum flow of 1,000 litres a second on the Cam River was set to dilute the Rangiora sewage. If the sewage wasn't in the river, the minimum flow would have been 750 litres a second. The sewage was removed from the river in 2006, and the river has improved markedly since then. The sewage was first put into the river in the 1920s, and the river seemed to be able to absorb it until the 1970s when the town began to grow. The town and the amount of sewage grew, but the river did not. By the 1980s and 90s, the Cam River had deteriorated and the water was grey and cloudy, and the stones had a covering of sludge on them, and the river plants had died. Today is very different, with clean stones, sparkling water, smoking water, and healthy plants. The sewage, amounting to 70 litres a second, was removed with no compensation to the minimum flow. The Zone Committee recommended that the 1,000 litres a second be retained. It was given faulty information on which to base this decision. This information was a flow chart showing 1,000 litres a second minimum flow at the bottom and 1,700 at the top. And you could easily gain the impression from that the river never got below 1,000 litres a second and was often at 1,700. There was nothing like that at all. 1,700 was only reached when the river was in flood, and the river got down to 600 litres a second at times. So it's easy to see how the Zone Committee made a decision to keep the minimum flow where it was and even suggest in the future raising it to 1,200 litres a second. And I've added to it flow information for the year 2015, and that encompasses two irrigation seasons, one from January to March and later on from December to the finish of the year. And that gives the accurate position of the river and the real one. The minimum flow of the Cam is treated different to the tributaries. The tributaries, the north and south, will have minimum flows at a lower level than the Cam, which means the Cam will have restrictions earlier than the tributaries, about a month usually. This is very unfair, and when this was shown to Mr. Bayfield, he allowed us to share with our neighbours, the Smiths, who irrigate from the South Brook. Environment Canterbury agreed that this would have only a minor effect on the potential of effects would only be trivial. So you have that letter, I think, haven't you?
Yes, we have,
yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, well, the Zone Committee, I've sort of covered that point already, I think. The Zone Committee says its goal for irrigation is 90% reliability. Well, that really isn't, I mean, that's the goal I think it should be aimed at, but that's not possible at 100 litres a second, 1,000 litres a second. There have been over 100 years of dairying on our property, and the Waimak District Council recently tested a lot of wells in the area, and with varying results, I understand. But the well on our farm, a 35-metre deep one, complied in every attitude, every part, and that doesn't got excuse me, much to do with the river, I don't suppose, but I do think it does show that our style of farming is fairly good towards the environment. Our farm is a self-contained one, i.e. all animal feed is grown on the farm with little nitrogen use. Our overseer figure is therefore a low one. Our farm is located midway between Rangiora and Kaipoi and has a river frontier on the cam of approximately 1 kilometre, most of it on both sides. Now, I think the fact that we have both sides of the river is important, in that most of the farms are set back boundaries and I don't see it quite the same, but because of that, we noticed early on when the sewage was doing harm to the river, what was happening, and the harm started at Rangiora and the sludge and worked its way down, and it wasn't until it really got to Kaipoi that it became recognised how bad it was. Now, there's the information that was sent to you just recently. One is called page 11. It recommends that the Cam River minimum flow be 800 litres a second. That's Environment Canterbury information. Another one that's page 15 says that the minimum flow was kept higher than it needed to be for effluent dilution, as did another one that's called page 10. And it said that the minimum flow for effluent dilution in the Cam could be 800 litres a second. Now, if that had happened, I wouldn't be here today. It's and it says down at the bottom that the critical in-stream values and the Cam River, the only one ticked is effluent dilution, and the effluent has been out a long time now, and the river has improved. I'm very appreciative of Mr. Bayfield and the Smiths in allowing us to work with them. That kept our farm viable. Without that agreement, our farm wouldn't exist as a farm today. This is Canterbury, you have to irrigate to survive. I'm a fourth generation on our farm. My son was the fifth, my 60-year-old son was the fifth. But he has left the partnership, and part of the reason for that was the stress caused by the unfair minimum flow of 1,000 litres a second. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Well, thank you, Mr. MacIntosh, for bringing these important things to our attention. Do you have any questions, Commissioner Van Voorthuizen?
Yes, I do. Yes, I do. We've had other submitters raise the issue of the Cam River minimum flow with us. Now, I just wanted to check, what value are you recommending to us in terms of litres per second for that minimum flow?
750 to 800.
Sorry, 700 to 800, was it?
No, 750 to 800.
750, okay. You might be interested, we had another submitter, John Talbot, who was appearing for Bowden Environmental, and he recommended a figure of 890, and he sets out the reasons for that at his paragraph 23. And if you're interested to read what he thought, then you might find that worthwhile having a look at.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. No further questions.
I thought he could do slightly better than that, though.
Commissioner Solomon?
Yes, I just have one question for Mr. MacIntosh. You mentioned earlier that the zone committee wanted to raise it to 1,200 litres a second. Did they say why they wanted to raise it to that?
Well, no, there's been no reasons that I've known. And that's the point on, with the information I've had from the zone committee, there's been a phrase from Ngāi Tahu that I don't understand, and I've tried to get the meaning of it, haven't been able to, and I'm not sure what the meaning of it is and whether that's tied up with the 1,200 litres a second.
Well, perhaps I could explain it to you. A COMAR report was done by Tipper and Associates, who recommended a flow of 1.2 cumex for the Cam River
Yes, that's right.
to sustain cultural flows. And I just wanted to know if that was the reason why the zone committee recommended 1,200 litres a second.
Well, possibly, it very likely was. But I think you can see from those the flow sheets that the water isn't there. I mean, if the minimum flow was raised to 1,200 litres a second, we wouldn't be able to irrigate at all. It's, I mean, it's I might be wrong, but it seems to be bad information has been given in this.
Thank you, Mr. Mackenzie. Mr. MacIntosh, my apologies. Thank you.
Well, Mr. MacIntosh, these are important issues that you've brought to our attention, and you've gone to a lot of trouble to make sure that we've got all the paperwork that will help us to understand it fully. And you've come in and given us your own explanation face to face. That's very good of you. We're very grateful. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Now, the next item of business is the submission by what is now Templeton Pegasus Town Limited. Good afternoon and welcome to you.
Kia ora. I'm Miss Booker and I have with me Mr. Webster, Mr. Andrew Webster from Templeton, Pegasus.
Thank you. Now, we have the original submission and the further submission. We have Mr. Webster's evidence statement in 7 appendixes, and we have your legal submissions, Ms. Booker, and there I have to say that I have not given them the full attention that they deserve. With other things happening, it's been a bit pressed, and so although I have gone through your submissions, I think that knowing that and seeing that they're a professional piece of work, we should invite you to take us through them.
Thank you, sir.
At the appropriate time. Now, we're happy with however you want to proceed, whether you want to give your submissions first or have Mr. Webster do his evidence first. What would you prefer?
Thank you, sir. I was going to raise that. I think for the Commission's benefit, it would be useful to listen to Mr Webster's background and context to Pegasus Lake prior to me giving legal submissions, if that would work with you.
Certainly satisfactory. I'll just bring it up onto the screen.
And can I query, would it be useful for Mr Webster to at least outline his conclusions and his evidence, or?
Yes, by all means.
Yeah.
Just however you would like it to go. We want to get the best understanding we can of the case that you're presenting.
Thank you.
And you'll be able to judge that well for us.
Thank you. Ms Webster.
Thank you very much, Mr Chairman, and Commissioners, thank you for the opportunity to present to you this afternoon. As set out in my evidence, I've tried to provide the background to the development of the water body that's generally referred to as Pegasus Lake, which is within the Pegasus town development in the Waimakariri district. It was originally consented in 2006 principally as a stormwater management amenity for that Pegasus town development. Construction was completed in 2009. So Templeton Pegasus wasn't involved. It's acquired the development subsequently via a number of other developers. So we weren't involved in the consenting or design, although we still have contact and use of the consultants who assisted with that. But I've endeavoured to set out my understanding of the principles and approach that were taken to the design and development at that time. As I've set out in my evidence, the Pegasus development land, or the remaining development land, and the body known as the Pegasus Lake were acquired by Templeton Pegasus as part of the acquisition of a portfolio of New Zealand development assets from Todd Property Group in December 2019. So the Pegasus development is a small component of it. The lake area itself was always recognised as an important amenity for that development and for the community. It's ultimately was intended and is intended to be a publicly owned asset, ultimately in the District Council, and that's contemplated in the district plan. At present, though, it remains a privately owned asset. It's enjoyed and used by the community generally, and generally managed by or at least uses are managed by the District Council. So, once again, as I've noted, Templeton Pegasus was aware when it undertook its due diligence on the Todd property assets in mid-2019 that there were a number of water quality issues associated with the lake. At that stage, it was understood that those, as they sort of stood at that time, those issues had been addressed, and that there would be, the requirement and desire to continue to work to address the management of the lake in accordance with all the documentation that Todd Property had developed. Templeton Pegasus, unfortunately, didn't anticipate that immediately following its acquisition in December that there would be almost immediately a significant event with a algal bloom, which would close the lake for a number of months. And we'd expected the opportunity and the capacity to work with the consultants and the stakeholders to manage the lake, to look at the options to improve the water quality and address the issues, and to do so in accordance with the current consent conditions. For a range of reasons, everybody's aware of the challenges through this year that progress hasn't been advanced as quickly as would have been ideal, but nevertheless, we're continuing to work to identify the best option or options for managing the lake, so that it satisfies its resource consent conditions and continues to be a valuable asset for the community. To provide a very general statement. That there are no easy or simple solutions to manage the water quality of the lake, and the options, such as they are very within the control of Templeton Pegasus, are extremely limited. Generally speaking, the options that are going to need to be explored are mechanical or artificial, and they have significant complications. So there isn't an opportunity to apply a particular a simple, easily selected option which is going to address the current consenting requirements, let alone those contemplated under the requirements of Plan Change 7. Just like to remind or point out to the Commissioners that the lake's primary purpose was for stormwater management. It wasn't designed or consented as a swimming amenity. It was contemplated it would be suitable for secondary contact use. And in our submissions, we're seeking flexibility on the options, on the targets, and on the time frames to achieve the objectives that are set out in Plan Change 7. Thank you very much.
Well, that's a model of clarity. Thank you, Mr. Webster. Any questions of Mr. Webster, Commissioner Van Voorthuizen?
Yes, just from reading your material, it seems obviously Lake Pegasus is an artificial water body.
Correct.
And it seems to me its primary purpose was for stormwater management, and it might actually be better termed as a very large wet stormwater detention pond, which leads me to wonder why it's even featuring in Plan Change 7 at all. I mean, it's not a natural lake. You've said yourself that it's never designed for primary contact recreation purposes, which makes me wonder why it's in Schedule 6 at all. I'm just kind of wondering why you haven't asked us just to remove it from those three tables, 8B, 8.6 and Schedule 6.
Mr. Commissioner, if I could ask Ms. Booker to address that. She'll, I think, cover that within her submissions when she presents the legal aspects.
So that was what the original submission did seek, to have it removed in its entirety. But because of the freshwater reforms that have come into play, it seems clear there that all the water bodies within the district must be managed to meet national bottom lines. And so we see challenges with seeking to remove Pegasus Lake from the Plan Change 7 without, while still being able to give effect to the freshwater reforms.
What about its inclusion in Schedule 6? Are you still
Yes,
you're
we're
seeking its
absolutely
removal,
seeking that
aren't you?
removal, and I'll address that in legal submissions and happy to answer any questions following me doing that.
Because I looked at the implications of Schedule 6, it only features in the stock exclusion rules, and there are no stock around the lake, so it seems to me absolutely pointless to have it in Schedule 6 as a starting
Absolutely
point.
agree, and you bang on there. And if you look at the wider plan provisions, the only other provisions relate to sediment, but that relates to rivers and not to lakes, so wouldn't apply to Lake Pegasus. So the point of including it, to me, there's no rules that link to the inclusion. And the officer's report was incorrect to state that there were, because they don't actually relate. So yes, sir, I'll address that in legal submissions, but you've already acknowledged our points that we're about to make there.
Right. So I guess, and to foreshadow your legal submissions, ideally I'd like it removed in total, but you now think the MPSFM doesn't enable that relief?
It can be removed in total from the Schedule 6, which I understand isn't intended to be a primary contact site under the MPS. I foresee challenges from a legal perspective of removing it from the Plan Change 7 in its entirety, even though that would obviously be something that would be the best outcome. And so instead, as I'll address in legal submissions, we'll seek to have targets so that they acknowledge that it's beyond the control of the consent holder to actually manage, because it's 90% groundwater, and it requires a management of the upstream nutrient inputs to be able to achieve those goals.
Okay. All right, well, I might have some more questions once you've presented to us, but certainly understand the case you're making. Thank you.
Thank you.
That's all. Commissioner Sullivan?
Yes, I just have a couple of questions. I suppose because I read your evidence and the history around groundwater contamination well before the lake came to be, I suppose you've investigated draining the lake completely and turning it into a rainwater garden or another stormwater facility?
So my understanding, and apologies, as I say, I wasn't involved in the original, that originally this area of land was a series, or was a much wetter, if that's the right term, area, and that essentially the lake has had the function of enabling the development of the land around it, and then what the groundwater effectively that would otherwise have been through various tributaries or whatever through this area is now accumulated in the lake. So it's fed by groundwater. It feeds through to the east into a conservation management area and a mudfish management area. So my understanding is the design of both the lake and those areas is interrelated. So in a sense, pulling the plug and emptying the lake pushes water into those management areas and isn't inappropriate, and would then simply refill,
Right.
following those. So one of the things items our experts are considering in terms of further management options are there options in terms of flushing the lake that I think has been explored and wasn't considered to be one of the options that's really available, principally because it then leaves the lake empty or there's a refill. So, but those options are part of that lake management plan investigation, which is ongoing.
So which leads me to the next question, the Eastern Management Coastal Area. Can you answer questions about how the Te Kohanga wetlands function and whether they treat nitrates or do they just control water velocities or...
I'm very sorry. No, I don't have the background to the design of that area or how it's now currently managed. No.
I was actually going to ask the Tūhaitara Trust, Te Kohaka Tūhaitara Trust, but I don't think, because I understand that they've taken over that area.
That is correct.
And I may get an opportunity depending on if and when they appear before us. So
Thank you.
I won't ask my questions of you. So thank you. That's all from me. Thank you.
Thank you.
You say there's no stock there, and in the normal sense of that, I understand that. But I've got a recollection that when I was there last, there seemed to be wild birds. Whether they were ducks or geese or what, I'm not sure now, because I'm thinking some years before I wasn't anticipating this conversation.
No.
Is there a problem with wild birds there?
No, as I mentioned in the answer to the previous, or non-answer to the previous question, the lake is adjacent to an area of land called the Eastern Conservation Management Area, and then beyond that is the sea. So it's an area of great sort of ecological diversity, and there are a number of species of birds and other animals in the area. No, I'm not aware of there being any particular issues. Obviously birds do come to the lake, and as they do into the conservation management area and the sea the beaches as well.
Thank you, Mr. Webster. Well, I think that's what we wanted to ask you, and we thank you for your evidence. And perhaps we'll now ask Ms. Booker to address us, bring it up, on her legal submissions, which we have received, but I haven't given the full study that they deserve.
Thank you, sir. And Mr. Webster will be available to answer further questions if necessary after I present legal submissions. So these legal... Oh, sorry, sir.
Please proceed.
Thank you. These legal submissions are presented on behalf of Templeton Pegasus in respect of Plan Change 7. As you've heard from Mr Webster, they own residual development land in Pegasus Town, including the artificial Pegasus Lake. The Pegasus Town residual development land was purchased in December 2019, as you've also heard, and we've stepped into the shoes of the submissions made on Plan Change 7 by Todd Pegasus. So the lake, or we've sort of underlined whether you call it a stormwater detention pond, but it is, known as Pegasus Lake, is predominantly fed by groundwater, and that's over 90%, and has water quality issues. It was consented 15 years ago by the original developer for the primary purpose of controlling stormwater. At the time Pegasus Lake was consented, the future water quality has been alerted by Commissioner Solomon, was foreseen as being uncertain based on what was known on the nutrient levels and the trends in the groundwater at that time. Hard limits for water quality were deliberately not set in the conditions of consent, as it was considered that it would set a future consent holder up to fail. So we're now fast forward to today, and Plan Change 7 now introduces and amends provisions for the Waimakariri sub-region, that's relating to Section 8 of the Land and Water Regional Plan, and introduces catchment-specific freshwater outcomes limits and provisions, which are specifically proposed to apply to the lake within the tables, and I'll take you through that shortly. We're also dealing with the National Policy Statement for Freshwater Management, which came into effect on the 3rd of September, and sets objectives and policies for freshwater management. The freshwater management framework requires the identification of freshwater management units, the identification of the values of those units, and the setting of environmental outcomes sought for those values, and the setting of target attribute states either at or above the baseline state to achieve those environmental outcomes. So it also imposes national bottom lines for water quality, which apply to Pegasus Lake. And when I read the freshwater policy statement, and I know, Sir, Commissioner Shepherd, you're obviously well aware and attuned to this, but the freshwater management unit is defined as any part of a water body or water bodies and their related catchments that a regional council determines under a clause to be an appropriate unit. But when you turn to the clause where they're required, so it does imply that they could exclude potentially water bodies from that definition. But when you turn to 3.8 subclause 2, the regional council must identify units for regions, and every water body in the region must be located within at least one freshwater management unit, and they've got a number of other things they need to identify. And so our review of this is that it would be extremely challenging to request that it's removed from Plan Change 7 in its entirety, because that would be challenging for the council to say that it's been giving effect to its obligations under the freshwater policy statement, but that was what was originally requested in the submission by Todd Pegasus. We're now seeking an alternative relief, which I'll walk you through shortly, which we submit is able to then give effect to this latest thinking on National Policy Statement for freshwater reforms.
Thank you.
So since its construction, the lake has been routinely monitored for water quality in accordance with conditions of consents. There's a trend of deteriorating water quality. Pegasus Lake has consistently failed to achieve specified performance criteria for water quality for periods over the last 6 years. And just to sort of elaborate on that, I believe that when it was first constructed, the view of the water quality experts, and they did some presentations and things to the community at that time, was that the lake, once it was constructed, was exceeding all water quality, problems they'd foreseen, and that it was suitable for bathing, and it was all looking pretty good. But then there has now been a consistent pattern for the past 6 years that the problems that were foreseen at the time of the consent, being the algal blooms, the deteriorating water problems, obviously the contaminated groundwater that brings in and fills up the lake from the bottom and the sides, are now readily apparent. So there was a patch where, and you would see in the response to the officers' reports, for example, that, well, people do swim in the lake, and that's acknowledged that people have swum in the lake. The reality is I'd have to confirm with Mr. Webster, but I believe it's been shut over the summer periods for a number of years now because of these blooms making it toxic for swimmers and dogs, for example. And the emphasis on the lake management plan has been on the recreational amenity from secondary contact outside of that time and the walking and the general enjoying the environment around the lake. I'll touch upon that a little bit later as well. So the lake has experienced stratification, algal blooms and closures to the public. And this has become consistent over the last 6 years. Critical factors linked to water quality in our submission are outside the control of Templeton Pegasus as a consent holder. So this includes the nutrient levels in the groundwater which filled the lake, which were high at that time and remain high and exceed national bottom lines, temperature, rainfall and wind. Improvements to water quality which can be implemented by the consent holder are limited in nature. So they've been explored in detail by technical consultants, and this is outlined in the evidence of Mr. Webster, and they've got management reports and options. And there are some options in terms of creating a better flow and bringing some of the groundwater or the bottom 3 metres of the lake up and trying to get that mixture through solar bees, but the results haven't been promising. And the clear indication from the management reports is that while some techniques may address one aspect, it won't be able to address the other. So there's the stratification issue and the cyanobacteria blooms, and no option seems to be able to address the issues. Pegasus Lake has not been monitored specifically for most of the attributes and outcomes set in Plan Change 7. That said, based on the available information from routine monitoring, Pegasus Lake will not meet attributes set in Plan Change 7, and it will also not meet national bottom lines set. So it's a degraded water body as defined in the policy statement. And that's been confirmed through an attachment on Mr. Webster's evidence, where Golders, who have been monitoring the lake for a number of years, has set out in a table what the Plan Change 7 seeks to achieve, what the national bottom line seeks to achieve, and whether, based on the information they've taken over numerous years of monitoring, I think it's 10 years now, whether the indication is that it can comply or will not comply. And the answer to all of those, and that's Appendix 6. Sir, I see you reaching for Appendix 6 of Mr. Webster's evidence, if you'd like to look at that. And I've also attached a table to my legal submissions which summarises those results as Appendix A. But what we've done to assist the Commission is we've set out the attributes that are sought to be monitored through Plan Change 7. We've set out what they are seeking to achieve under Plan Change 7, what the national bottom line was in the Freshwater Policy Statement 2020, and then what the report, the Golders report is limited in the sense that it looked at the proposed freshwater policy statement, that was 2019, but there's only been a couple of changes in terms of the attributes listed and the levels there. And the view is that the information, which is a limited data set, but has been collected in terms of monitoring the lake, is unable, they're unable to right now achieve those targets that are set in the plan. No one can give a time frame as to when they could achieve those because the inputs are obviously upstream and sought to be regulated through other means, and they won't be able to meet the national bottom lines. So on that basis, which I'll address a little bit shortly, we were seeking that targets are identified on those national bottom lines, which you have the ability to do under the Freshwater Policy Statement for degraded water bodies to set targets that are difficult but not impossible, and that can be achieved over a time frame through an all-of-catchment approach as opposed to putting the requirement onto the consent holder to achieve those now. So Todd Pegasus had been working with Waimakariri District Council, Canterbury Regional Council and other stakeholders and industry experts to implement measures to improve water quality. And there are practical, scientific and technical limits facing the consent holder in respect of improving water quality. The real issue seems to be nutrient inputs, something which is not controlled by the consent holder. Reducing land-based nutrient losses to groundwater from the lake's inland source area must occur for Pegasus Lake to achieve Plan Change 7 and NPS Freshwater Management 2020 outcomes and limits in the future. And this has been acknowledged in the officer's report. And I've just put the reference there for you. At paragraph 8 of legal submissions, I say, as currently drafted, the limits specified in Plan Change 7 and the associated directive avoid policy will be problematic for Templeton Pegasus when existing consents are reviewed and renewed. And there's a requirement for a consent in 2021 and the remaining suite of consents in 2041. Todd Pegasus submitted requesting Pegasus Lake be excluded from Plan Change 7. It's accepted that this is not a viable relief now. The Commission must give effect to the MPS Freshwater 2020 when it's within scope of the Plan Change 7 to do so. We agree with the submissions that were presented to you from the Canterbury Regional Council in that respect. So the NPS Freshwater Management requires degraded water bodies to be improved over time to targets at or above the national bottom line for the compulsory values and other relevant values identified. Templeton Pegasus is alive to the uncertainties around the ability for management of the catchment as a whole to improve water quality and is seeking relief that will not be counterproductive to its ability to implement measures on an adaptive basis over time required to improve water quality. For this to occur, some changes are sought to the provisions as drafted. The proposed changes will implement and give effect, in our view, to the Freshwater Policy Statement 2020 and are within scope of Plan Change 7. So we're seeking at paragraph 11 that, as the Commissioner has already asked questions on, that the reference to Pegasus Lake at Motu Key Jetty is removed from Schedule 6, which is areas on rivers or lake commonly used for freshwater bathing. That limits and outcomes set specifically for the lake in Table 8B and Table 8.6 of Plan Change 7 should be expressed as national bottom lines, but stated as targets with appropriate timeframes given. And that an additional policy which enables the renewal of existing resource consents for stormwater runoff to Pegasus Lake and the trial and use of adaptive management techniques for informing possible future water quality parameters in Pegasus Lake, which are not consistent with policy 28.4.28a. And you may find it of assistance that I've attached an appendix to the legal submissions which track changes into the plan provisions in terms of exactly what we're seeking as I walk through what we are seeking, just to make that really clear for you. We are trying to seek something that's reasonable and able to be achieved in terms of what you can grant. And we feel like that what we're seeking now strikes that balance in terms of giving effect, but allows that flexibility.
So you're referring to your Appendix B, is it?
That's correct, sir.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah. And I will address that shortly. Templeton Pegasus supports ECAN managing reduction over time of the nutrient inputs that are likely the primary cause of the water quality in Pegasus Lake. For its part, Templeton Pegasus, as has been acknowledged by Mr Webster, will continue to manage the lake in accordance with its obligations as consent holder. So technical consultants are actively monitoring water quality and assessing and trialling mitigation options. And this is set out in his evidence if you need more information about this. Objectives and mitigation measures for improving water quality are specified in a lake management plan. And this lake management plan was updated in 2016 as a result of the deteriorating water quality that was done through Golders. And conditions of consent for Lake Pegasus require monitoring and reporting of water quality performance to ECAN, which they do, I think it's by every 2 monthly visually and in a form of a report at the end of each year. So that will obviously continue to occur and they'll continue to strive for the best water quality outcomes they can achieve within their control. So I will now address the relief sought in detail and as acknowledged by Commissioner Shepherd, the relief sought is also set out in Appendix B. So the first relief sought, and I will brush over this because I feel you have a great understanding of this having previously answered some questions, removing Lake Pegasus from Schedule 6. We're requesting that be removed. It was rejected by the officer's report on the basis that it's known to be used for primary contact recreational activities. So it's submitted in response. It's not designed as a freshwater bathing lake. It's a privately owned artificial lake and it's been consented with the primary purpose of controlling stormwater. Use for secondary, not primary contact recreation is incidental and conditions of consent require the quality of the water in the lake to be generally suitable for that secondary contact recreation. It is acknowledged by the Regional Council that this isn't sought to be a primary contact site as defined by the MPS, so the removal would not be contrary on that basis to the MPS because it's not intended to be a primary contact site. And I would suggest that the public may confuse the Schedule 6 lakes with the primary contact recreation sites by having it included in there. And that's been acknowledged by the officer's report that could be an outcome of including it. And I would submit most importantly, and as the Commissioner has picked up, the policies and rules directly associated with Schedule 6 are not applicable to the urban environment of Pegasus Lakes. Key jetty provisions relevant to Schedule 6 and the wider regional plan apply to rivers and would not apply to Pegasus Lake. And so just for your benefit, at footnote 14 and 15 of paragraph 15C, I've identified the rules that are linked to Schedule 6. Livestock exclusion from water bodies, stock exclusion, fine sediment removal from rivers. So none of those actually apply to Pegasus Lake. So it's in my submission there's no purpose or benefit for the inclusion in Schedule 6. The Regional Council functions will not be better achieved by the inclusion, and the cost of inclusion in my submission is confusion, and it should be removed. The cost of inclusion is confusion. That paragraph's confusing, isn't it, as well? So that's the first relief sought. That's identified in Appendix B. I turn now to limits and targets for Pegasus Lake. And it may be helpful to turn, as I speak, to Appendix B, and in particular Table 8B and Table 8.6, where the lake, Pegasus, has been identified as within the freshwater management unit of Ashley River, and that it has been specifically identified with a number of outcomes sought to be achieved for the lake. So Table 8B and 8.6 in Plan Change 7 introduce water quality outcomes, limits and targets specifically for Pegasus Lake. Strategic Policy 4.1, which is not part of Plan Change 7, seeks that the water bodies will meet the outcomes set in the sub-regional sections within specified timeframes. So the default timeframe is 2030, which is 10 years away. And that's obviously outside the Plan Change 7 within the wider regional plan. So Plan Change 7 extends actions to achieve the targets in 8.6 for total phosphorus and total nitrogen until the 1st of January 2040. So there's acknowledgement by the Regional Council for those two particular attributes that they would be unable to be achieved, and they've set them as targets with a timeframe to 2040. The national objective, so we agree that they're set as targets, and as I'll turn to later, we're seeking to have a more consistent timeframe, which I'll address shortly. So the National Objectives Framework articulated in the Freshwater Management Policy Statement requires ECAN to, as I've addressed in the opening, identify freshwater management units. So that's addressed at 18, and I won't go through that. I'm sure you're familiar with it. And at paragraph 19 of my submissions, I talk about ECAN must identify the baseline state of each attribute using the best information available at the time. So in my submission, as we'll address shortly, that best available information is the monitoring data that we've been receiving through technical consultants in line with the consents, and set a target attribute state which is at or above the national bottom line. So there are some exceptions to being able to do that, which I've set out. Footnote 20, which is your large hydroelectric schemes and your naturally occurring processes. These don't apply to Lake Pegasus. So the lake is required to have attribute states which are at or above those national bottom lines. A timeframe for achieving the target attribute state must be identified, and when setting target attribute states, regard must be had to the environmental outcomes and the target attribute states of any receiving environments, connections between water bodies and connections of water bodies to receiving environments, and the best information at that time. So timeframes can be of any length, but must include interim target attribute states and be used to assess progress towards achieving the target attribute state in the long term. So, as I've just spoken to earlier, Pegasus Lake is a water body that's regulated by the MPS. The monitoring data for Pegasus Lake is limited, and it's not a complete picture, but it is in our submission the best available information that we've got. Mr. Andrew Webster, who we've obviously heard from, has attached the Golders report, which compares the historical monitoring data that they've done to the attributes proposed in Plan Change 7. This is submitted to be the best available information for the purpose of setting a baseline state. And so based on this, it's submitted that it does not meet Plan Change 7 target attributes. It does not meet national bottom lines in either Appendix 2A or Appendix 2B. And we therefore seek that the tables, that's 8B and 8.6, be amended to reflect the national bottom lines. So they need to come down from the aspirational higher levels down to the national bottom lines. They're currently degraded below that. They need to come down to reflect the national bottom lines, which is the minimum to achieve, and then they need to be identified as a target. So the measurements of attributes, and this is really a tidy up, but we accept that the measurements need to be consistent as well. So there's some attributes here that are identified in 23B of ammoniacal, nitrogen, cyanobacteria, chlorophyll A that are recognised in different terms. That's not a point that we're worried about so much. We accept that the Regional Council will specify the measurements in the way that they see fit. We acknowledge that they need to be consistent with freshwater management. We're seeking that those baselines are recorded and that they're a target or difficult to achieve but not impossible for Pegasus Lake. So E. coli table 22 from the MPS, we're submitting that we don't want that to apply to Pegasus Lake because it's not classified as a primary contact site, and that table has certain obligations under the MPS for primary contact sites. And the attributes in tables 8, 6 and 8B should be specified as targets to be implemented by a date of 1st of January 2080. And that date is just taken as what has been specified elsewhere for the northern Waimakariri rivers, with targets to be implemented by that time frame. So we've just taken as being needs to be consistent with other water bodies which have been identified as degraded and needing to have aspirational targets. So I've summarised those changes in Appendix A, and that's really just to assist your understanding. And you may or may not find that useful, but I definitely did. And so at Table A, I've set out the parameter, the attribute of, for example, total nitrogen, Plan Change 7 target, what the national bottom line is, and what the monitoring data has been indicated of whether we're able to achieve or not, and then the amendment sought as a result of that. So take, for example, cyanobacteria is a good one because that one is currently, the blooms every summer. So if we look at cyanobacteria, there's a national bottom line of 1.8 millimetres cubed per litre of the biovolume equivalent of potentially toxic cyanobacteria. And so the Golders report concludes that it's been routinely monitored and consistently does not meet that national battle line. And so we've sought an amendment to reflect the MPS and to propose it as a target. And just for context, so that is 1.8 millimetres cubed per litre. The measurements have been recorded by the Golders reports, which are attached to Mr Webster's evidence, in excess of 3,000 or 5,000 millimetres cubed per litre. Like that's a significant degradation, and it's so far away from that national target. It's a long way away, so we don't feel that requesting the national bottom line, we feel that requesting the national bottom line is appropriate as a very, very, very difficult target to achieve. If it would assist, I'm happy to go through each one of those attributes, otherwise I can continue with my submissions.
Yes, I think you can continue. Thank you.
And the remainder, the final relief sought is in relation to the policies. So policy 8.4.2.28A talks about freshwater outcomes for Pegasus Lake. So as we've alluded to, or as we've discussed, Pegasus Lake was consented. Its purpose was to receive discharges from rainwater and treated stormwater from the surrounding commercial area. So there's discharge permits which authorise the discharge of water and contaminants to Pegasus Lake or land in circumstances where they may result in entering those lakes. So that those consents will be reviewed. The Pegasus Lake is located within the Ashley Estuary, Te Aka and Coastal Protection Zone. So policy 28.4.28 states, and I've set this out at 26, with the officer's report's proposed amendments, that for all activities within that coastal protection zone, that Pegasus Lake is within, discharges of contaminants to surface water or onto land in circumstances where contaminants may enter water are avoided as a first priority. And only where avoidance is impractical, the best practical option is used to minimise the loss and discharge of contaminants so as to achieve the water quality outcomes in Table 8B and Table 8.6. So you've got a policy there, an avoid policy, which directly links to these tables that we're talking about not able, the Pegasus Lake water quality data not being able to achieve. So the scenario is when the consent holder goes to reconsent the lake for the discharge, which obviously it was consented for as the primary purpose, they won't be able to avoid it in the first instance. So we'll be looking at a best practical option which needs to achieve those water quality outcomes. So in our submission, without the reference to a target state, if it's a hard bottom line, it's going to be very difficult, it's going to be impossible in my view and my experience to be able to actually reconsent those based on that policy. So policy 28.4.2a is a directive policy, and following the Supreme Court decision in King Salmon, it's clear that the words mean what they say. The use of the word avoid means just that. Do not do it. Don't do something in the first instance. Then use the best practical option to minimise the loss and discharge of contaminants so as to achieve the water quality outcomes. And this is problematic for a number of reasons. Paragraph 27a, the best practical alternative is linked to achieving the water quality outcomes and limits set for Pegasus Lake. Templeton Pegasus is unable on its own to achieve the water quality outcomes and limits set for Pegasus Lake in those tables respectively due to the inputs from groundwater and upstream contaminant sources that are beyond its control. No single option or combination of options exists for Templeton Pegasus to resolve water quality issues experienced. Some additional mitigation measures have been implemented, and even with these measures, there is no sign of the degrading water quality trend reversing. Based on policy 28.4.28 as worded, after expiry of the original discharge consents, new consents for the same purpose would be required, in my view, to be declined. And having consented Pegasus Lake for the primary purpose of receiving stormwater runoff, creating a framework in Plan Change 7 that could restrict that ongoing primary purpose in the near future seems nonsensical. So policy 28.4.28 further highlights, while it's critical in my submission that the limits and outcomes set specifically for Pegasus Lake in those tables be expressly stated as targets with appropriate timeframes. An additional policy would be of assistance, which expressly enables the renewal of the existing resource consent for discharges to Pegasus Lake to continue, and the trial and use of adaptive management techniques for informing possible future water quality parameters in Pegasus Lake. And I've suggested some wording at paragraph 30 of an appropriate policy, which could be implemented there. In terms of the timeframes to achieve that, we spoke with consultants when we were preparing evidence for this hearing, and they're not in a position, based on their experience and knowledge, to even indicate when a time frame could be achieved. They can't tell you whether it's ever going to be able to be achieved, the national bottom lines for Pegasus Lake, because of the circumstances surrounding its construction and monitoring. And what we've sought there in terms of timeframes is we've taken what the regional plan has specified for rivers for the North Waimakariri, and that was specified as being 2018. It's acknowledged through the MPS now that there are specific clauses in there which relate to degraded water bodies, and the council has an obligation, ECAN has an obligation with the MPS to respond to that degradation. So if the regional council detects a freshwater management unit or part of a freshwater management unit, which is in this case Pegasus Lake, is degraded or degrading, it must, as soon as practical, take action to halt or reverse the degradation, for example, by making or changing a regional plan like they're doing here in terms of nutrient inputs, and any action taken in response to a deteriorating trend must be proportionate to the likelihood and magnitude of the trend. It's completely acknowledged that there will be likely to be an action plan that will take into account broader issues, and Templeton Pegasus are obviously more than happy to be involved in that process and be part of that comprehensive all-of-catchment approach to reducing a degraded water body. What we're looking at Plan Change 7 is things that are going to currently, without all of that in place, adversely affect the consent holder's position, and in our view and submission have not been justified on the evidence that's been submitted by the Regional Council. So we're seeking that flexibility in the shorter term with having these targets, acknowledging that there's consents that remain active for the lake and that there's water quality outcomes sought in those consents that they're required to achieve and are currently in some circumstances not achieving, and having to really work on mitigation options to bring the lake up to that water quality anticipated even by those consents. But acknowledging that there will, in the near future, based on, I hope there will be in the near future, based on the requirements of the MPS, be that all catchment understanding and analysis done by a regional council. So we are limited within the scope of Plan Change 7. So it is acknowledged that the lake must remain in Plan Change 7 to give effect to the 2020. My submission would be that having that additional policy would still give effect on a broader level when you're looking across the entire freshwater management unit. It would still give effect, acknowledging the limits to the lake and allowing a renewal of discharge, would still give effect to that policy based on the broader objectives being achieved across the entire plan change. However, the classification, target and timeframe for Pegasus Lake needs to be realistic, given the basis on which the consent was first granted and the limited ability for the consent holder to effect change. So those are the legal submissions and the evidence, and we are both happy to answer questions.
Well, thank you very much, Ms Booker. Commissioner Van Voorthuizen, any questions of Ms Booker?
Yeah, so just in a nutshell, you're asking us to set the relevant water quality limits at the national bottom lines and make them targets with very long timeframes for achievement.
Correct.
So to the staff, this issue that's been raised by this submitter is an interesting one. In the RMA, the definition of water body includes a pond or a wetland, and as this submitter has said, MPSFM policy 3.82 says every water body must be in an FMU. Does that necessarily mean, though, that including it in an FMU means that it must be rolled into the relevant water quality tables? I mean, I'm not sure that's the case. So can you come back and reply and address that? I'm not convinced that is the case, but then I'm not a lawyer. And if it is the case, then every pond and wetland in the region needs to be rolled into these tables. And that certainly has not happened. Or every pond and wetland in the areas that PC7 covers anyway. So that'd be OTOP, YMAC, every pond, stormwater wet pond, every sewerage treatment wetland, every pond on a farm. I'm just not sure where that would end us. So it's kind of curious why this one has found its way in, but all the other ones haven't.
We'll respond to that in the reply report.
Yeah, it seems to me it's either all or none.
Would be happy with that approach if it was excluded.
All right, but no further questions for you. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner.
Commissioner Solomon?
No, I have no further questions either.
Well, Ms Booker, I'm not quite sure that I've captured the full force of your paragraph 30.
13, sir.
You know, I'm not clear in my mind why it's necessary to have some specific provision that would enable the renewal of existing discharge permits. And in your delivery of that, you used the word allowing a renewal. I wouldn't want to be involved in something that sort of unconsciously preempts the outcome of an application for a renewal. So I just feel that I owe you the opportunity to explain to me why there needs to be a specific provision about renewal when, at least under the Act as it is at the moment, there would be the opportunity to make an application for a replacement consent as an existing consent gets towards its time of expiry.
Thank you, sir. And I obviously agree with the position under the Act. The challenge I see with Plan Change 7 being granted in its current form is the policy 8.4.28A is an avoid policy. And that specifically relates to discharges to, and currently, because Pegasus Lake is included within Plan Change 7, discharges to that lake. So we have a situation where there is a policy, an avoid policy, which says you must avoid discharging in the first instance to a water body which is recognised, which Pegasus Lake is, and in the second instance it's got to be the best practical option to minimise the loss or discharge so as to achieve the tables, the water quality tables. So, sir, the reason why we're seeking an exception to that is this is a stormwater pond for the Pegasus Lake area. And the challenge we have is it's been included, has been acknowledged by the Commissioner. It has been one of the only ponds included in here. This will incidentally create a very, very difficult, possibly, most probably impossible outcome where it won't be able to be reconsented on that basis. I accept that consenting for the stormwater discharges will need to be considered on their merits and in light of the best available information at that time, and there will need to be conditions of consent which provide environmental limits and manage effects. However, the possibility, in my view, that something which for the purpose was to receive stormwater could no longer not be used for that becomes nonsensical. So what we're suggesting by including a policy, and so I acknowledge your concern with the word enable, which allows or accepts the Pegasus Lake, if it is to be included in Plan Change 7, from that avoid policy on the basis that it would be considered on its merits in light of the context and purpose for which it was constructed. So if I was to pick up on your concerns with enable, perhaps it's that we're re-amending that policy to allow, maybe not allow the renewal of existing discharge permits and the trial as exceptions.
Understand. Thank you. And I understand now and also welcome the constructive answer of coming up with another word that you'll be able to give some consideration to.
Thank you, sir. And I would note that if the council would accept that the Pegasus Lake didn't need to be in its consideration included within a freshwater management unit, then that policy obviously would not be necessary.
Quite so. I understand. Well, Ms Booker, thank you for your submissions and for presenting them as you have. And we also thank Mr Webster for his part. We're grateful to you both, and we're glad that you've come in to present it today.
Thank you. Kia
Thank you
ora.
very much.
I think our next business is the submission of Scottville Farm. Are they represented here today?
Yes, they are. They're just stepping up now.
Thank you. Good afternoon and welcome, Scottville Farm. And I'll give you the opportunity to introduce yourselves in a moment. We have the original submission and we have the evidence of John Larson, and we've read that, so you won't be needing to read it to us, but you'll certainly have the opportunity to speak to the submission in whatever way you would be comfortable with. So who's going to be speaking?
Thank you for this opportunity to represent our Scottville Farm submission. My name is John Larson. I'm 56 years old, and before I go any further, perhaps I should mention I'd like to read through an abbreviated summary of my evidence.
Yes.
That you have a copy of and have read, if that's okay.
Of course it's okay. If that's what you'd like to do, that's what you're here for.
I'm pretty nervous. I'm pretty nervous. I'm not used to this.
Just take it in your own pace, and we'll be comfortable with it. We're interested in what you have to tell us.
Thank you. I'm a current managing partner with my two sons that are with me here today. I've been arable farming all my working life. Together we farm 760 hectares of intensive arable and lamb fattening, with our base being in Woodfields Road, Rangiora. Most of the land we farm is on Woodfields Road in the proposed nitrate priority sub-area E. But we also lease several other blocks, the main one being in West Ayrton sub-area B. Just a little bit of background to our history. We've been farming in this area for 5 generations. Originally my great-grandfather farmed at Cust, then my grandfather purchased land in 1922 where we're farming now, and we have, along with the boys here, made significant investment in land ownership and resources over many years, including very recently, and we've seemed to provide for each generation. And Scottville Farm is now a very productive and efficient operation. Just a little bit about it, what we do. Scottville Farm is an arable farm that specialises in small seed production, being mainly ryegrass and clover seed, but also cereal seeds and vegetable crops. In combination with the cropping side, we finish at least 10,000 lambs a year. Just an overview on our irrigation and water supply and monitoring. We use irrigation water from both the well scheme along with several irrigation wells, and we can irrigate 80% of the land that we farm. The first wells were developed in the early 70s by my father and are still in use. Under the well supply agreement, we have FEP requirements, and this past year we achieved an A grade up from a B grade 2 years prior to that. We have extensively monitored our water use and requirements for 18 years now. This has been done mostly with what they call neutron probes, which are installed in every field that we have a crop in, all this at a substantial cost to the business. We have weekly reporting. During the growing season, provided we don't get a rain. That makes sense. Just on a community aspect, the farm business employs 10 full-time staff, has at least 12 part-time, and is a main income source for 6 families. A further 10 families are supported from lease of other farmland. The flow and effect from the 7 million of revenue created from our business to the local economy and wider is significant. Scottville Farm relies on dairying for up to half of its revenue, so we will feel the effects of PC7 on dairying in this district. The mental well-being of many persons are implicated in the proposed plan in its current form. Just excuse me. I wanted to discuss the objective of PC7 that's most relevant to our submission. Based on my understanding, PC7 has been introduced to serve the key objective of maintaining or improving water quality through reducing the amounts of nutrients and contaminants from eating fresh water bodies. Therefore, PC7 has been introduced to regulate farming systems that may return surplus nitrogen in meaningful quantities. From my observation, the main relevant desired outcomes that relate to us is outcome 4, the zone has safe and reliable drinking water, preferably from secure sources. Outcome 6, highly reliable irrigation water to a target of 95% is available in the zone. Outcome 7, optimal water and nutrient management is common practice. And lastly, outcome 8, there is improved contribution to the regional economy from the zone. Now, my comments for these outcomes to occur, we need MAR and TSA to happen in a well-managed way. We need increased water reliability for irrigation. We need farmer training on irrigation, nutrient budgeting and modelling. And for the last one, which is improved contribution to the regional economy, I don't believe this will occur with PC7 in its current form, as it is too restrictive and imposing on farming, which is still the main source of the regional economy. If it's all right, sorry, I hope I'm not too long and slow, am I?
Oh, no, we want to hear what you've got to say, and we're not rushing you at all. Just take your time and make sure that you take the opportunity while we're listening and you have our attention to say what you want to say.
And that's very good. I just wonder if I could pull up a map.
Yes, of course.
Now on screen.
Yes, well, the hearing manager will help you to put it on the screen.
I think it's saved here already. Can you see that?
Oh, yes.
That's, I think it was in my submission, my main submission.
Yes.
That just shows the blocks of land, our main blocks of land that we farm that are in the E zone. And then
Yes.
I've just put on this further one here, which just extends it out a bit further so we get a bit more feel for where we're farming. I don't know whether you can see that little bit of orange in there amongst the purple.
Yes, I can see that.
Thank you for that. Under efficiencies and effectiveness of the PC7 provisions in achieving its objective, I'd just like to go through half a dozen or so issues that we see. The first one, issues with PC7 regulating nitrogen losses from arable farming. I'll just stress the arable farming part here. Inputs and outputs are relatively equal with arable farming, especially compared to dairy farms. We use nutrient calculators to establish requirements for the crops we grow. Small amounts of nutrients will be introduced back into the system. Just a further comment here, very little fallow, I don't know whether commissioners would be aware of, in the old days there was a lot of fallow done in our area. Just my comment is very little fallow is done these days compared to 50 years ago, so there's less N leaching as a result of this, because obviously land that is fallow is non-productive, and now we always have a crop in the ground, and cover crops are used in these situations to soak up any potential excess nitrogen that may be in the soils. I trust that makes sense.
Understand that, yes.
We have an issue with overseer. It's not a suitable tool for crop farming, as there is too many variations within it to contend with. It wasn't designed for arable farming, and although it's been used for, I guess you call it benchmarking, it has a lot of factors that can make a major difference to the result. I can't stress enough the importance of accurate measuring and modelling going forward before these major changes are implemented as proposed in PC7. It concerns me that we haven't got the data accurate, in particular with crop farming, to be able to say with certainty what the potential N loss to ground is. I've got an issue with the baseline GMP, and this is particularly in relation to farmers who were or may have already been operating with good management practice, and it may not also recognise improvements that have been made at that date. We recently purchased a block of land that we'd leased for a number of years, and we sent it for analysts to 2 different consultants, reliable consultants that do a lot of this overseer work, to see what difference we got and to establish a baseline figure. We had the 2009-2013 data for this property because we had been leasing it, so we keep good records, so we had all the information there, and we sent all the same information to both consultants, and one came back with a 45 N loss and one came back with a 75 N loss, and it just can't be right. There's something missing. So that's why I don't have faith in the modelling that's currently used. A further difficulty we have is with this reductions, long-term reductions in the table 8-9 that relate to these zones that we've got up on the screen. I think long-term reduction plans are untenable if they are proved to be required. A goal, as suggested by 2030, would be okay, 2040 maybe, but in our opinion there will be major improvements made by then and monitoring will be more accurate. I'd like to point out that no major government infrastructure changes in New Zealand are made without accurate data to back up their requirement. along with the cost and benefits established and carefully considered first. I've also got an issue with the zoning of these boundaries, which has obviously come up a few times before in the last 2 days that I've been listening in. It's been quite clear that it is very questionable. I might just pull up the previous one we had on the screen, because this just shows a bit closer at home. If you notice on the northern boundary of this slide, we lease a property in the right-hand corner there, and there's the boundary of this proposed sub-area E, is on the northern side of our property that we lease. And
Yes.
You'll notice there's 2 large farms to the north of that, and further land west that's not even in the zone. These are all converted dryland sheep farms to dairy farming in the last 20 years since the will scheme. And I don't know why they wouldn't be included in a table. And the block to the west of there is a dairy support unit, irrigated. I agree with Will's suggestion that it would be fairer to have across the catchment. It would be fairer for all farmers to just have one zoning if it's required. But I will add that maybe 2 zones could be justified, with heavier soils perhaps requiring smaller reductions, and the stonier free draining soils potentially greater reductions because of the greater risk of nitrate leaching. Just while we're on that subject in relation to this property that we're talking about, it seems quite unusual to me, having known the area and the type of land in this area for all my life. On the very north of this block that we lease, where the boundary of the zone is, it is starting to get into what we call light shingly country, where the water table can be right at ground level in wet seasons. And there's a flow that comes from those properties north of us through this property in times of high water table. There's actually a natural water course. So it comes from the north through the property that we lease. But then we don't have to go very far, and we go back south to where our main property is. And if you study the soil maps that I've got in my submission, you'll see that there's a strip of heavier land that's where we predominantly farm that runs through this red zone. And back on that, what we call the home block, which is the main block south of that, I can't really point to it, can I? But the water table would be 7 to 10 metres below ground level. So we're well above the water table. We're on you might say, a high spot. It's quite noticeable if you actually focus on it. If you're going down what we call two-chain road, there's quite a hump in the road. And that good piece of land comes right from further up, down through, and is where we're predominantly farming. And it seems very unusual to me that there should be such major proposed restrictions on these better soil types. A couple more points or issues, I call them, I'd like to go over. One is the transfer of water permits and water zones. We have Woodfields Road running between several of the blocks that we farm with permits on both sides. On the south side of Woodfields Road, we're in the over-allocated ear zone. On the north side is the, I was going to say under-allocated, but not fully allocated cuss zone. it seems unusual to me to not be able to use or transfer water consents from one side of the road to the other, when we know that the flows from these streams actually do that anyway, the flows that we irrigate from. I've also observed that any reductions in being able to irrigate increase the risk of nitrate leaching, simply because, with my little understanding, is that farmers have an innate tendency to water more than they need to if they're short of water, and thus they'll fill up the water holding capacity of the soil more than they need and the crop has to have. And then if we get a heavy rain, well, we get potential leaching. But they do this more because they haven't got enough water and they're trying to store it in the soil. So it doesn't lend itself, restrictions on water, how do I put it, consents or reductions on them doesn't help nutrient management, rather the opposite. My last issue, and it's an important one to us, is, as I read it in the PC7, there's to be restrictions on increasing horticultural areas. And to restrict any increase in horticultural area is, in my opinion, an affront to the care of people and the need for food. The production of soil for man's food and sustenance is a testimony to God's power. And resurrection. We all know when we plant a seed that it dies and it brings forth much fruit. When we're planting seeds every year, we plant all our crops, but the result is a positive. And I'm a firm believer. I believe in God. He created the earth and for man to live in it. So why would he not want the best for us and provide the resources that we need to use? Is he not in control? So I'd like to now go over, if it's all right, benefits versus cost of the relevant PC provisions. While I support the objective of the PC7, I do not believe the benefits achieved by PC7 outweigh the costs that follow as a consequence of the provisions. I've included a question here. How does the government set a target of lifting primary sector export earnings to 10 billion a year by 2030 as per its current plan if the proposed PC7 goes ahead in its current form? Seems to be an anomaly to me. Well, I don't know what the word is, I'm sorry. It doesn't make sense anyway. I'd like to just discuss the cost to arable farmers. If we have to reduce our fertiliser inputs, our outputs will drop and growing will become uneconomical. I'd like to quote a paragraph out of a nitrate assessment for the interzone source area catchment. Arable run at GMP reflects a very efficient system where nutrients are captured by the product, and any reduction in losses will tend to have a direct reduction in yield because they require a reduction in inputs. Because of the high levels of fixed costs and the small margins in cropping, it is not likely to be worthwhile to take this approach. So I say the cost to our arable operation will be severe if we have to reduce inputs. And we also depend on dairy farmers who buy half of our products. Arable farmers have invested in considerable infrastructure and resource compared with livestock farmers and will not be able to survive. I guess I'll just make a comment here too that it seems that arable farming's hardly mentioned in the PC7, for good or bad, I'm not sure, but it still affects us obviously. But there's not a lot of us in this area really. There's 2 or 3, 4, maybe half a dozen reasonable sized farms that would do arable, not like mid-Canterbury. And my main block there is surrounded by houses, 10-acre blocks, so that's a challenge too. We don't want to get into that. I'd also like to say a little bit about the cost to the wider community in New Zealand as a whole. I cannot emphasise enough the need of farming in the Waimak district for the prosperity of people. And as I've quoted in my submission, Scripture, Ecclesiastes 5, verse 9, moreover, the profit of the earth is for all. The king himself is served by the field. So that's even the Prime Minister, I suppose, we'd think of today. I mean, we're all dependent on the field. And my comment is loss of food production becomes a high risk when there's a disease or pestilence or serious drought. The economic disaster for the district and the effect on the lives of so many people would be much greater than any effect from nitrate levels in water that is below the recognised World Health Organisation level of 11.3 milligrams a litre in drinking water. I'd like to ask the question, where is the information that actually tells us that persons are dying in New Zealand from current nitrogen levels in drinking water? I wonder if it's all right. I've got a brother that's quite passionate about Germany. He's been there a few times and he used to farm alongside me, but he's got no son, so he's now in separate business and we farm some of his land. But he was talking about there's a lot of previous history in some of these older countries, as I call them, and they've been through this exercise of nitrates. And he was quoting to me, albeit it's on money what he's told me, that they had levels of 20 to 30 that they were trying to manage, and they reduced a bit similar to what we're doing. Any land that wasn't cropped for a year, they've got a lot of valleys. It's not exactly flat like us. I understand it's more rolling country. And any land that wasn't cropped for a year had to be planted in native grasses and things like that. And it created a bigger issue because what they found was that the arable crops, the roots went down a lot deeper and soaked up a lot more of the nitrates. And I understand they're quite shaly underneath their topsoil. This may be just one area, I don't know the detail, but they've got this quite shaly underground, which obviously is easy for the water to run in, but where they cropped properly, there was less of a problem because it soaked up the excess nitrogen. So the level's well above what we have to contend with here. I'd like to go on now to what options have we got. Maybe I should go to what I've got here. Are the PC7 provisions the most appropriate way to achieve the PC objective? And my conclusion is, in short, no. And I've put down 3 items under relief requested here. The first one, PC7 provisions relating to reductions in nitrogen deleted entirely. 2, proposed limits in increasing horticultural area removed. 3, transfer of water permits within neighbouring zones be provided for where appropriate. So those are the 3 points we'd like to request. In addition to that, I'd like to make a few suggestions on a way forward and comments. That's okay.
Yes, yes, I've been following more or less your summary on the more detailed material that you've already sent us. Are we now going off that track and having an addition to it?
Yes, I am a little, just confirming,
Yes, that's right.
Just
so that I know where we are. It's just navigation on my part.
No,
And please go ahead and give us the suggestions that you'd like to offer.
that's good. I appreciate the way you're following. Thank you. So some suggested way forward is I've already requested delete arable farming altogether from PC7 provisions. That's number one. Number two, MAR and TSA to reduce and address any elevated nitrate concentrations in rivers and aquifers. So I've seen information on that come through and firmly believe that it can assist in any issues. And thirdly, encourage good management practice for all farming based on accurate science, not assumptions. We need to be clear that in Canterbury there is already major improvements that have been made to farming systems to manage nutrients sustainably. Number four, further proof as to what is the main contributor of EN to groundwater and whether it is actually the problem for health at the levels we currently have, which are well below the level set by WHO. Number five, and I think this is important, farmer education and training, not restrictions. If unjustified or unreasonable restrictions are imposed, as proposed with PC7 in its current form, there will be many lies told and the end effect, there will be no improvements made. I don't know whether I need to expound on that, but I just feel that I think 90% of farmers want to do the right thing and improve their sustainability and go by science and facts. There may be a small percentage of, I don't know whether you call them pirate farmers or that are slow to embrace this, but I just feel that more will be gained by taking the farmers along with us. And that goes to my next point, 6, the use of technology to reduce leaching and manage farming systems, taking the farmers along with us. And then point 7, which is obviously another option that was discussed today, I think, with the CCC, other methods of treating water, if required, to reduce nitrate in drinking water, reduce nitrate leaching or nitrate in drinking water without affecting the New Zealand economy, which is currently very dependent on the dairy exports to maintain our current standard of living and recover from the effects of COVID-19. I have some further comments, if it's suitable, in relation to CCC assumptions. Would it be all right if I made some comments?
Some comments about what, the subject?
About CC's, the Christchurch City Council's and their request for a 1 milligram a litre.
Yes, if it's related to that, yes, you can give us your comments.
Thank you. I am appalled at the suggestion that some councillors are saying there's potential contamination of the deep aquifers of the city from farmland on the north side of the Waimate River, and that nitrate levels in water should be reduced to 1 milligram per litre, when the WHO standard for drinking water is 11.3. Christchurch has beautiful water because of the Waimate River, which supply the aquifers under the city. I did a quick calculation, and the wider Christchurch community of 400,000 people use an average of 400 litres a day, and I see that wanting to get that back to 300. and I worked out this is equivalent to 1.5% of the average flow of the Waimak River. I believe, I personally believe, and I've had many others that have, persons that have had experience, that the Waimak River currently feeds those excellent aquifers that we are privileged to have under the city. And as they said today, I think that's why the city was built here. I'm concerned about Christchurch City Council. I think they've got enough problems here since the earthquakes. The Avon River is one of the most polluted rivers you can see. What about the damage still not repaired to the city's infrastructure, sewers and water reticulation? What proof have we got that the aquifers are not being contaminated out of their own backyard? Where is the proof that all this is in order? My advice to them is to put their own field in order. I've observed for many years that land is best looked after by farmers, and wherever council-owned land, there is seriously poor management. You only have to look at the council-owned plantations that have been harvested and all the rotting material and weed and broom and no crop cover to soak up any nitrates that may be leaching to the ground. I've got a couple of other comments I'd like to make. Has there been consideration of lifestyle blocks and whether there's any contamination from septic tanks to groundwater? I also had information supplied to me about a deep well that was recently installed northwest from Darfield, which is apparently not an easy area to get water from. And they established the water was 150 years old and it had elevated nitrate levels. So I'm asking, why is this water at this age still got elevated nitrate levels when we didn't have dairy farming here? I don't think 150, we had it 100 years ago in some areas, but not 150 years ago. I am concerned too that if there was any contamination, and I underline the if, from the Waimak area, you would surmise that it would come from the large area that was previously the Airwall Forest and are now irrigated, where the land is very stony, I guess we call it, and would be or could be subject to nitrate leaching. A lot of that area there was a couple of big farms that we used to know, the Spencer Bowers, and there's another family there too that had large farms that developed that land. I think they put in an irrigation system off the Waimak in the early 60s, it might even be, and it was all border diked. Well, now that's all spray irrigated, so you might say that's actually potential to reduce the nitrate leaching on those particular farms. I guess what I want to point at, sorry.
Mr. Larson.
Sorry.
All very interesting, but getting a little bit away from your submission, I'm wondering whether we've reached the time where we might see if the commissioners have any questions of you to make sure we've got the full force of your own submission.
I appreciate that, and apologies for getting slightly sidetracked.
It's all right. No, we've allowed you that freedom. Questions for Mr. Larson, Commissioner Van Voorthuizen?
No questions of clarification, thank you, that's fine.
Questions, Commissioner Solomon?
No questions from me either. Mr. Larson was quite clear in his explanations. And I thought you did a great job of delivering. You lost your nervousness in the end.
Thank you. Thank you for that.
Well, gentlemen, you know our purpose is looking for improvements to the Plan Change 7 that we can recommend to the Regional Council. Improvements, the source of which are submissions such as yours. And you've come along with a constructive approach of making suggestions, and that's what suits what we're doing. And we always have a better understanding from practical farmers and their own experiences, their views and their hopes. And that's what you've been providing us with this afternoon. You've come here to do that, and we're grateful to you for that. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you for the time. Am I allowed to say one other thing?
Yes, of course you can. It's a free country.
In presenting this submission, you feel as though that you really want to do your own. I mean, it's I was going to say reasonably selfish. You're thinking of yourself initially, but I must admit, when I went to lawyer to get this submission drawn up, and we spent quite a bit of money, I tried to get across to her that this is for everybody. It's not just for us. But it's quite hard to get that across because the lawyer tells you you've got to be. It's about you. It's not about everyone else. But I am interested in everyone's prosperity, and I was even interested in the last submission on Pegasus. My family frequently go down there and walk around that lake, and some of our kids have done sports on the lake, water sports, boating and so on. And I have observed, interesting enough, that there's not a lot of flow going out of that lake or coming in. They've got you can see where it goes out, and with my simple mind, I feel that lake would improve dramatically if it had a better inflow or a greater inflow. Because there is wildlife, there is a lot of ducks and duck poo around. I've seen it. I can witness to that. And it's a great resource for the town, but I'd love to see it better. And I don't know and whether it's been actually proven that it is farmers contaminating the water upstream. I'd be interested to know what the nitrate levels were actually coming into that lake. It would be quite interesting. But anyway, that's just an aside. I hope that's all right.
Yes, that's all right. I wonder whether Mr. Webster will watch the recording of this and take it up.
I hope he doesn't hold anything against me.
Of course he won't. Well, this is the advantage, isn't it? You can see him and you can get an idea that he's not going to be taking it against anybody. He's open.
Good.
As we are.
Thank you.
So, well, thank you, gentlemen. Good to meet you. We're glad you've come in.
Thank you.
So does that conclude our business for today?
Yes, that does.
So in the morning, we'll have Mrs. Barnett and the Ellesmere Sustainable Agriculture. Is that right?
Yes, that's correct.
Well, that'll be another return visit from her. All right, well, we'll adjourn now and start again tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock.